Hey everybody, we are at lesson 272, which is part 2 of our discussion of colonial society and culture. So we're first going to look at our objective, and we're switching it up on you a little bit from part 1. Just make sure you note that there's 2 different objectives this time around between part 1 and part 2. So we're going to look at how and why the different goals and interests of European leaders and colonists affected how they viewed themselves and their relationship with Britain. So we're going to start getting into those little cracks that are going to form in the foundation of the colonial British relationship. And of course, we know where those are eventually going to wind up. So let's start off and talk a little bit with the growing unease with England that's emerging in the colonies. In part 1, we saw all this plurality and diversity happening in the colonies and the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening. All of that is contributing. And don't forget that it's so important to remember that the colonies developed their own form of self-rule and almost kind of quasi or semi-independence for England for the first couple generations that they were in existence. The colonists do like the benefits of Anglicanization and the closer ties with England when it comes to material goods, but they're chafing at the collar a little bit when it comes to more control from England. They can't reconcile those two things in their head. And it's made even more complicated by the fact that sometimes Britain is enforcing the rules like the Navigation Acts, and other times Britain's not enforcing the rules like the Navigation Acts. So the colonists kind of feel like, oh, do it or don't do it, but we're all over the place and we just get used to governing ourselves. Then you come and tell us what to do again. So there's a very complicated relationship that's emerging there. Another problem that causes unease in the colonies is British colonial institutions. If you remember, originally the colonies had to form their own governments because Britain wasn't involved in the colonization process. But now that the colonies are making money and lucrative and attractive to Britain, they want to assert more control like they do all of their overseas territories. And that means bringing British political institutions into the colonies. One of the prime examples is that of the royal governors, the chief executives of each colony. Britain declares that they will all be royal governors appointed by the king and serving the king, a lot of times coming from England to govern the colonists of Massachusetts or Rhode Island or Connecticut or Georgia. They are also sending over sometimes the military to assist with tax collection, and every major city had a royal tax collector who was in it. So the colonies kind of said, well, we have our own elected legislature, and now you're sending a government-appointed executive over, and we're not real cool with that. Some of the primary complaints the colonies had occurred along the frontier. The frontier is the very western edge of the colonies. And at this time, we're talking like the end of Massachusetts or the end of Virginia, right up against the Appalachian Mountains. So it's not that far in, but for the colonies, it was a vast distance away. And the colonial frontier was generally territory where you would find your poorer colonists. Because the land was cheaper out there and it was available. It hasn't already been assigned like it has on the eastern coastal part of the colonies. If you want to get a good start, you're going to have to migrate out west. So all those new immigrants from Ireland and Scotland and Germany moved to the western, the back end of the colonies, as well as those indentured servants who got land as a result of completing their indenture in the southern colonies. That's where their land was. The problem was the land was cheap, but the expense was high, because if you want to buy any manufactured goods, you have to lug them all the way out to the far end of the colony where roads may not even be in existence or much more than a dirt path. If you're growing, let's say, corn or wheat, those cereal crops, and you want to take them to the coast to sell, that's going to be an additional expense. The closer you are to the coast, the cheaper it is to do business because you have to travel further to load your stuff on your ships and send it away. In addition, we see an overlap with the Native Americans along the frontier, because in almost every colony we saw wars similar to Metacom's war, where the natives lost and they were pushed back out of the English settlement. And of course, as English settlements get bigger, natives lost more and more land. So the frontier is where the natives were. That's where they had been shoved from the coast. And now we see colonists, Englishmen, coming into that territory. So people who have been pushed and pushed and pushed westward now feel like there's another intrusion into where they are living. And that close proximity between English and natives is going to lead to sparks that ignite conflicts, just like it did along the coast with Metacom's war. So we're going to take a look at one specific incident in American history that embodies several different examples of this that took place in the colonies. And it's called Bacon's Rebellion. And Bacon's Rebellion takes place in the Chesapeake in Virginia, and it's one of those sparks that ignites into a huge explosion. And when it's over with, it's going to expose a lot of underlying conflicts that are in the colonies. So what happened in Bacon's Rebellion is former indentured servants in Virginia were given land on the frontier right up against the native cultures that were there. And there was tension between them. Both sides accused each other of land theft and trade deals gone wrong and stealing and violence. And when a native attack killed some Virginians who were living there over a trade deal they said the Virginians had ripped them off on, that spark ignited into a full confrontation. And the white Virginians living on the frontier put a call out to the Virginia government on the coast, to Jamestown, said, send the military, send help. We need you to position soldiers out here to protect us and to protect our natural right of property that we have. Unfortunately for them, the Virginia government was not very responsive. It was composed of the planters, don't forget, who were safely on the East Coast, away from all these conflicts. They knew that war and military action cost money that they did not want to spend, and they rightly agreed that the frontier people sort of caused this problem by aggravating and agitating the Native Americans who were living out there. So they really don't see any need to send military troops out, and they say politely, thank you, but no, handle it yourself and stop causing problems. For the frontier people, they said, oh, those are the king's lackeys. That's the king's government. All they care about is keeping England happy, not the people. So a guy named Nathaniel Bacon initiated a group of people, a mob really, to decide they were going to go to Jamestown and they were going to overthrow that government, that planter government, that English government that wasn't protecting them and wasn't responsive to their needs. And they targeted Governor Lord Berkeley, who was appointed by the king. Also, awkwardly, Nathaniel Bacon's uncle, so that probably made for some awkward Thanksgiving celebrations later on. But as Bacon's Rebellion marched from west to east, marched to Jamestown, a lot of former indentured servants and current indentured servants joined with them. The mob got bigger. And by the time they got to Jamestown, they burned the Capitol. Governor Berkeley and the legislature took off. And it wound up that the British military had to come in and eventually put down Bacon's rebellion and restore order. Bacon himself died from what they called the bloody flux, which is a nice way of saying he drank bad water and pooped himself to death. But that marked the end of the rebellion. So why is Bacon's Rebellion important? There are three reasons. One, it exposed that divide between the elites and everybody else in the colony. The coastal wealthy elites, whether they were Puritan elite or planter elite that lived in the more prosperous areas, were the haves, and the people on the frontier were the have-nots. And that rift was a new wrinkle in the colonial development. Second, it showed a growing colonial mistrust for institutions of British rule. Their anger was focused more on the governor than on the legislature in Massachusetts, though they had plenty of anger for the legislature. But they felt the governor wasn't willing to take up arms on their behalf. He was only there to serve the king. They weren't wrong in that. And third, it marked the beginning of the end of indentured servitude because the planters in Virginia said, we got to do something else. If these people are going to pick up guns and hatchets and rakes and come after us, we can't have that. And the problem with indentures is when they're finished with their labor after 10, 12 years, they have to have land, and that creates new landowners and new problems. So we instead are going to switch to the use of enslaved African people because they never get free and they are caught under our control. So we don't have to worry about them rising up and causing problems. So the Bacon's Rebellion marks the tipping point between indentured servitude and slavery arising from those tensions on the frontier. The other thing we're going to take a look at is more colonial resistance growing to British rule. What Bacon's Rebellion starts, it spreads throughout the colonies. And there's a number of reasons that American colonists began to question and challenge British government in the colonies. First of all, was that colonial self-governing tradition, self-rule. I think this is like the fourth time we've talked about this. It's a big, important idea. That the colonists like the idea of having town meetings or having representative democracy, where the people who govern you are your neighbors. So if they tax you, they have to pay those same taxes. They weren't real hip on people in London, England, making laws and policies for them. Second, the Enlightenment opened up some new ideas in the colonies. The first was the idea of natural rights, that all people are imbued by their creator, whether it be God or something else, with the right to life, so you can live your life without fear of being harmed or killed, the right to liberty, our freedom to do what you want, and the right to pursue property, to try to accumulate some wealth for yourself. And the Enlightenment taught that these are fundamental rights that nature gives people, and governments cannot take those rights away. So an English Enlightenment philosopher named John Locke said, I'm going to do you one better. I'm going to take those rights and I'm going to form an explanation of the origin of government around those rights. And Locke crafted what's called the social contract. And he said the very first governments were formed in the colonies when people mutually got together and agreed to give up some, just a skosh, of their rights to the government. Give up a little freedom, give up a little pursuit of property, mainly freedom, to the government, and it will make laws to keep you safe from each other and protect your property and your natural rights. And so that government crafted by the social contract is answerable to the people because they gave it its existence. And as long as the government does that and keeps your natural rights protected, everything's great. However, if the government fails and crime goes up and people start stealing your stuff and murders start taking place, it's failed. The social contract is broken and people have a right to dissolve that government and form a new one to try to do it better. So Locke's ideas are a direct contrast to what traditional thinking in Britain and honestly in the colonies was, and that was called divine right. And it's an old idea that comes out of the Middle Ages that God selected the kings and the kings carried out God's will and they answered to God directly. And whatever they did, they just had to justify to him, which was okay because he felt like they were these worthy individuals. There was no accountability to the people. And so divine right was a very European idea where the social contract really kicked in the colonies. And Britain kind of had a hybrid of the two, but they still had the king and the idea of the king being all powerful, or at least mostly powerful. So John Locke's idea prompted this idea in the colonies that we can challenge government. We can criticize it in the newspaper. We can tell the governor, the royal governor, what we think of him. We can petition parliament. We can publish pamphlets. And we can air our grievances to the government because after all, we created it. Not something that the British government is going to like. They don't want to be criticized. They have divine right. They're governing because they're correct. So The last thing that leads to this resistance to British colonial rule, here it is again, the First Great Awakening. And we've talked about this time and time again, that it was the Great Awakening, while it was religious in nature and challenging religious tradition and authority, more importantly, it challenged all authority in the colonies. And it opened up this idea that we don't have to accept the status quo. So take the Great Awakening, mix in some natural rights, mix in a little John Locke, and mix in some ideas of self-government that go all the way back to the foundation of the colonies, and those cracks in the foundation of the British-American relationship now are getting much deeper. So again, by the time we get done with this lesson, hopefully you can identify how and why the goals and interest of Europe was different than the colonies, and how the colonies are going to start to view themselves and what their relationship with Britain is going to be. Again, we're edging closer to what is the inevitable American Revolution. And that's all for this lesson. Have a good day.